The moment Chuck Norris spoke those words about Bruce Lee, he had no idea that within only a few minutes, the entire arena would fall silent. At first, thousands of people laughed, cheered, and applauded, encouraging every remark he made. Then something happened that no one had expected. An unfamiliar man quietly rose from his seat. He did not argue, raise his voice, or try to draw attention to himself. Yet from the instant he stood up, the mood inside the arena shifted in a matter of seconds. A handful of spectators stopped talking. Then entire rows fell quiet. Before long, even Chuck Norris himself had gone silent. Witnesses would later say that something seemed to change in that moment, as though everyone suddenly realized what they had failed to notice only seconds earlier. And when the stranger's identity finally became known, such complete silence settled over the crowd that every footstep could be heard. To understand why it happened, however, it is necessary to go back a little earlier. That evening, no one could have imagined how what seemed like an ordinary joke would eventually end. The venue was packed long before the event began. Some visitors had driven in from neighboring cities, while others had waited in line for hours just to secure a seat. Every person there wanted the chance to see the legendary Chuck Norris with their own eyes. For years, his name had stood as a symbol of strength, discipline, and confidence. The moment the announcer introduced him, the audience erupted into thunderous applause. People jumped to their feet. Some whistled, others recorded the moment on their cameras, while many simply shouted with excitement. Chuck stepped into the spotlight, wearing his familiar smile, calm, composed, and completely at ease. He carried himself like a man who was fully in command of every situation. The crowd adored him. Every movement inspired another wave of applause, and every joke was rewarded with laughter. Everything unfolded exactly as expected until the conversation unexpectedly turned toward Bruce Lee. The instant Bruce's name was mentioned, the audience became noticeably more alert. People exchanged glances, and a few smiled knowingly. The subject had fascinated fans for years, and even after all that time, the debate over who had been the greater fighter had never truly disappeared. Chuck allowed himself a slight grin. He paused deliberately, almost as if he wanted the anticipation to build before delivering his next line. The strategy worked perfectly. The arena gradually grew quieter as everyone waited for what he would say next. Standing before an audience of 5,000 roaring spectators, Chuck Norris lifted the microphone and spoke the sentence that no one had expected to hear. "Bruce Lee looked incredibly fast on screen, and I'll never deny that," he said. "But movie speed and a real fight are two completely different things." A ripple of laughter swept through the arena. "Put him in a real ring against a real fighter," Chuck continued, "and he wouldn't last even a single round." The crowd exploded with amusement rather than surprise. A man seated in the third row slapped his event program against his knee while laughing. Near the center aisle, two karate students jumped to their feet, mockingly striking exaggerated martial arts poses and waving their arms as though performing in an over-the-top action film. One of them kicked an empty folding chair into the aisle and shouted loudly, "Watch out, everybody! The movie master is about to fly in from the ceiling." The laughter only grew louder. Then the chair suddenly stopped moving. A single hand rested gently on its back. A short man wearing a dark jacket had been sitting several rows away from the ring, partially hidden by the shadows. Throughout the evening, he had watched everything in complete silence, one leg crossed over the other, his eyes fixed on Chuck. He had not applauded the demonstrations, had not smiled when Norris broke wooden boards, and had shown no reaction to the chants echoing through the arena. "Norris, Norris, Norris." The roar of the crowd was so powerful that it seemed to shake the steel beams supporting the ceiling. Then the quiet stranger rose to his feet. The student who had kicked the chair turned toward him, looking down with an amused grin. "Got a problem?" The stranger offered no reply. Without the slightest hint of irritation, he looked first at the chair blocking the aisle, then calmly raised his eyes to meet the young man's face. The student's smile widened. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, wearing a spotless white GI beneath an unzipped athletic jacket. Everything about him suggested someone who had never been embarrassed in front of an audience. His friend stepped closer, chewing gum with his arms folded across his chest. "Sit back down, Shorty," the taller student said. You're blocking everyone's view." The man in the dark jacket did not move. Meanwhile, Chuck Norris continued speaking inside the ring, unaware of what was unfolding in the aisle. Perhaps he noticed only some movement in the audience and assumed it was simply another enthusiastic reaction. Every spotlight remained fixed on him. The microphone rested comfortably in his hand. Tonight, this arena belonged to him. "Don't get me wrong," Chuck continued as he walked slowly between the ropes. "Bruce is talented. He's an outstanding performer and an incredibly charismatic man. Nobody in Hollywood sells a punch better than he does." Laughter rolled through the stands once again. But fighting is something completely different. It's pressure, it's discipline, it's standing across from someone who couldn't care less how impressive you look. Near the aisle, the student leaned closer to the quiet stranger with a mocking smile. "Hear that?" he said. "Movie tricks won't save anyone in here." For the first time, the stranger spoke. "Move the chair." His voice was calm, quiet, and completely free of anger or threats. Yet the three closest spectators immediately stopped laughing. The student blinked. The composure in those few simple words irritated him far more than any insult could have. He pressed one hand firmly against the chair, forcing it deeper into the aisle. "You move it." The stranger's eyes drifted slowly toward the student's hand before returning to his face. Just a couple of seats away, Dan Inosanto suddenly leaned forward, every muscle in his face tightening. "Bruce," he said quietly, "don't." The name landed like a spark falling into a pool of gasoline. The young man chewing gum instantly stopped chewing. The confident smile on the taller student's face began to fade. He looked at Dan, then at the man in the dark jacket, then back toward the ring where Chuck Norris continued addressing the roaring crowd. "No," he whispered, "it can't be." The longer they stared, the harder it became to deny what they were seeing. Then, at last, one spectator shouted the name loud enough for the entire arena to hear. "Bruce Lee! That's Bruce Lee!" A wave of disbelief swept through the audience. People stared at one another before turning back toward the quiet man standing beside the aisle, then back toward the stage again. Many struggled to understand what was happening. Others tried convincing themselves it was simply someone with an unbelievable resemblance. But with every passing second, certainty replaced doubt. The longer the audience looked, the fewer doubts remained. Even the loudest spectators suddenly fell silent, as though someone had muted the entire arena. Chuck Norris remained on the stage, no longer smiling, no longer joking, and no longer carrying the effortless confidence he had displayed only moments earlier. His eyes were fixed on a single man. Everyone noticed. No one had ever seen that expression on his face before. The event host attempted to ease the tension. He forced an uneasy smile, adjusted the microphone, and stepped forward. But the words seemed to die in his throat before they could escape. No one was paying attention to him anymore. Every pair of eyes was locked on the stranger, who was no longer much of a stranger at all. Bruce Lee calmly walked toward the front rows. He looked completely untouched by the excitement surrounding him. There was no trace of nervousness, no desire to impress the audience, no theatrical display of confidence. Only absolute composure. That quiet confidence affected the crowd more deeply than any dramatic entrance ever could. People were used to bold speeches, spectacular performances, and larger-than-life personalities. This was different. No one argued. No one tried to prove anything. Yet the tension hanging in the air grew stronger with every passing second. A young spectator suddenly rose from his seat. "Is that really him?" Many people heard the question. No one answered. Everyone was waiting for Chuck. Slowly, he walked toward the edge of the stage without taking his eyes off Bruce. The entire arena seemed frozen in place. People were afraid to move, convinced that the next few moments would become the defining memory of the evening. Chuck tightened his grip on the microphone, drew a slow breath, and finally spoke. "It's been a long time." Gasps spread through the audience. People exchanged puzzled looks. They had expected a joke, an argument, perhaps even a confrontation. They had expected almost anything except those words. Bruce answered with the faintest hint of a smile, so slight that many never noticed it at all. Chuck did. His own expression softened almost imperceptibly. For the first time all evening, someone in the crowd began applauding. Another joined, then several more. The applause faded almost as quickly as it had begun because no one knew what would happen next. Everyone sensed that the most important part of the evening was only beginning. Chuck stepped a little closer. "I see you heard what I said." Once again, silence settled across the arena. It was so complete that the microphone produced a faint echo. Bruce did not answer immediately. He looked across the stands, studying the thousands of faces before him. Only then did he turn back toward the stage. "I didn't hear your words," he said calmly. "I heard the reaction." The audience seemed to freeze even more. People exchanged uncertain glances. They could feel there was a deeper meaning behind the statement, but few understood it yet. Chuck studied Bruce carefully. "And what do you think?" The question lingered in the air. 1 second, then another, then a third. It seemed as though the entire arena had forgotten how to breathe. Finally, Bruce answered, "People spend far too much time comparing those they should simply respect." Absolute silence followed. No one had expected an answer like that. Not a single person. Some spectators frowned as they tried to understand his meaning. Others simply watched without taking their eyes off him. Chuck remained silent. It was obvious he had anticipated something entirely different. Bruce continued, "When people become obsessed with choosing a winner, they often forget why legends exist in the first place." The host slowly lowered his microphone. Now he was listening just like everyone else. Some people insist one man was greater. Others are equally certain the other was. In the end, everyone argues about the past and forgets to notice the present. Someone in the front rows nodded thoughtfully. Then another, and another. With every sentence, Bruce held the audience more completely. No one remembered the jokes anymore, no one laughed, no one shouted from the stands. Thousands of people were listening, truly listening. Chuck smiled. This time, however, it was a very different smile. It carried respect. "So," Chuck said with a quiet grin, "you came here to give everyone a lecture?" A few cautious laughs drifted through the audience. Bruce slowly shook his head. "No," he replied, "I came to see what people choose to applaud." His words settled over the arena like a heavy curtain. Many spectators instinctively lowered their eyes. Only a few minutes earlier, they had laughed at the expense of a man they were now listening to with complete attention. That single sentence transformed the atmosphere. People began remembering their own reactions, their own laughter, and the excitement they had shared only moments before. Chuck looked across the audience, then back at Bruce. Suddenly, he asked a question that no one had expected. "Then answer me honestly. If you could leave these people with only one sentence, what would it be?" The tension inside the arena reached its highest point. Even those who had been the loudest supporters sat perfectly still. Every person waited for the answer. Bruce remained silent for several long seconds. Then he slowly climbed the steps leading to the stage. He moved without hurry, step by step. The entire audience followed every movement. Time itself seemed to slow. When he reached Chuck, Bruce accepted the microphone, looked out across the thousands of faces before him, and spoke only a few words. Words that many people would remember almost exactly for years afterward. Before saying them, however, he unexpectedly shifted his attention toward someone in the audience. His eyes settled on the same young man who had laughed louder than anyone else earlier that evening. It was as though Bruce was speaking directly to him. The young man felt it immediately. An uneasy feeling tightened in his chest, and he unconsciously straightened in his seat. Bruce took a slow breath. Then he began. After only the first few sentences, everyone realized that this evening would affect far more people than anyone had imagined. The entire arena stood motionless. Thousands of eyes remained fixed on the stage. No one whispered, no one reached for a phone, no one looked away. Everyone wanted to hear what the man who had completely transformed the evening would say next. Bruce slowly swept his gaze across the audience. He looked from row to row, meeting the faces of people who had been laughing, arguing, and applauding every bold statement only a short time earlier. Now they were truly listening. He allowed another long pause to settle over the room until the silence itself felt almost tangible. Then he spoke. "The most dangerous opponent a person will ever face is not standing in front of them. He lives within." The arena somehow became even quieter. Several people frowned as they searched for the meaning behind those words. Others simply listened, unwilling to miss even a single sentence. Many people spend years trying to become better than everyone else, Bruce continued. Very few spend those same years trying to become better than themselves. Several audience members nodded slowly. There were no dramatic slogans, no theatrical delivery. The words were simple. Precisely because they were simple, they struck with remarkable force. Bruce paused again before continuing. People love comparing who is faster, stronger, more talented, or more successful. He looked across the crowd. But there's a problem with that. The moment you become obsessed with watching everyone else's path, you stop seeing your own. Near the back of the arena sat a middle-aged man who had come after an exhausting workweek. Earlier he had laughed with everyone else. Now he found himself thinking about his own life. Bruce's words reminded him of how much time he had spent comparing himself to other people, and how many opportunities had slipped away simply because he had been too busy watching someone else's progress instead of his own. He wasn't the only one. There were countless people throughout the arena experiencing the same realization. Each listener heard something different. Each found something deeply personal within Bruce's words. Chuck Norris stood beside him without speaking. He no longer tried to joke. He no longer felt any need to argue. Like everyone else, he simply listened. Bruce continued speaking. A victory over another person may last a single day, he said. Sometimes it lasts only a minute, sometimes only a few seconds. But overcoming your own weaknesses can change the course of your entire life. A thoughtful silence spread through the audience. It was as though everyone had forgotten why they had come. Only a short time earlier, they had expected entertainment. Now they were receiving something far more meaningful. The event host looked across the sea of faces in disbelief. Throughout his entire career, he had never witnessed an audience paying such complete attention. Thousands of people sat perfectly still, almost afraid that moving might cause them to miss a single word. Bruce glanced once again toward the young man who had laughed the loudest earlier in the evening. The young man immediately noticed the look and felt the same uncomfortable knot in his stomach. Not because Bruce seemed angry, quite the opposite. There was no judgment in his expression, no irritation, no resentment. That quiet kindness somehow made the feeling even harder to bear. Sometimes, Bruce said calmly, a person believes they already know everything. He paused, and that is exactly the moment they stop learning. The young man lowered his eyes. Although the words were directed at the entire audience, they felt deeply personal. Perhaps others felt the same. Bruce took one slow step forward. There are people who want to prove they are right, he continued. And there are people who genuinely want to become better. He looked across the audience. They are not the same. Spectators began exchanging thoughtful glances. The idea itself was simple. Yet almost everyone had experienced it at some point in life. Everyone had argued. Everyone had wanted to win. Far fewer had ever stopped to ask whether winning had actually made them a better person. An elderly woman seated near the front quietly wiped away a tear. She could not have explained exactly why. There was nothing sad about Bruce's words. They simply encouraged people to look honestly at themselves. That is never easy. By now, the atmosphere inside the arena had changed completely. This was no longer an evening of entertainment. It was no longer a competition. It had become something far greater, something people would carry with them for many years. Bruce looked over the crowd once more. Then, for the first time all evening, he smiled genuinely. Do you know what's most remarkable? Several people instinctively leaned forward. Every person in this arena has the ability to change their life today. He let the sentence settle. Not tomorrow. Not next month. Not next year. Today. Right now. Those simple words left many spectators motionless. The message sounded obvious. Yet it was surprisingly difficult to accept. Everyone dreamed about changing something in life. Most people simply kept postponing it until next Monday, or next month, or next year. Bruce seemed to understand that hesitation perfectly. The greatest mistake, he said, is waiting for the perfect moment. His smile faded slightly, because the perfect moment almost never arrives. A quiet murmur of agreement spread across the arena. For the first time in a long while, the audience responded aloud again, but now there was no mockery, no ridicule, only respect, only understanding. Chuck Norris looked at the audience before turning back toward Bruce. Then he smiled, a real smile this time. "I think," he said with a quiet laugh, "the main guest tonight isn't me anymore." The audience laughed as well. The laughter was warm, good-natured, free of sarcasm. Even Bruce allowed himself a slight smile. Then, without warning, something happened that absolutely no one had anticipated. A man seated near the middle of the arena slowly rose to his feet. A second person stood. Then a third. Then another. Within moments, entire rows of spectators were standing together. At first, no one understood what was happening. Even the organizers looked confused. Then the reason became obvious. People began applauding. Not because anyone had asked them to. Not because they had been prompted, simply because they wanted to. The applause grew louder, stronger, longer. Soon every single person in the arena was standing. All 5,000 spectators. Chuck looked around the venue before turning back toward Bruce. He slowly shook his head, almost unable to believe what he was witnessing. The applause continued. 1 minute passed, then another still. No one wanted to sit down. No one wanted the moment to end. It was at that moment that the evening took another unexpected turn. Chuck Norris picked up the microphone and waited patiently for the applause to fade, just enough for his voice to carry across the arena. He looked directly at Bruce before speaking. "It's one thing to talk about skill," he said, "but people always want to see it with their own eyes." A wave of excitement spread through the crowd. People exchanged eager glances. Everyone seemed to understand exactly where the conversation was heading. Chuck paced slowly across the stage without taking his eyes off Bruce. "I think everyone here is asking themselves the very same question." He paused intentionally, allowing the anticipation to build even further. What would happen if the two of us faced each other right now? For the briefest instant, complete silence returned. Then the arena exploded. Thousands of spectators leaped to their feet. Cheers blended with applause. Voices echoed from every direction. Some chanted Chuck's name. Others shouted their support for Bruce. Many simply stood there in disbelief. The evening had already become unforgettable. Now it seemed destined to become legendary. Chuck smiled faintly. The audience was reacting exactly as he had expected. Once more, he turned toward Bruce. "What do you say?" The entire arena fell silent almost immediately. Nothing else mattered now. Everyone waited for one answer. Bruce remained quiet for several seconds. He calmly surveyed the stands before meeting Chuck's eyes. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That tiny movement was all it took. The audience erupted once again. The roar became so overwhelming that the host quietly stepped aside, recognizing that every ounce of attention now belonged to the two men standing on the stage. Chuck carefully placed the microphone on a nearby table. Bruce walked forward. Neither man's expression changed. Both remained calm. Yet with every passing second, the atmosphere grew heavier. The organizers quickly cleared the center of the stage. People seated near the front leaned forward. No one wanted to miss even the smallest movement. The tension became almost unbearable. Finally, only a few feet separated them. Once again, silence settled naturally over the arena. No one requested it. No one demanded it. Everyone simply understood that this was the moment they had all been waiting for. Chuck stepped forward. Bruce answered with a step of his own. The long-awaited demonstration began. Chuck slowly raised his hands into position. Bruce stood opposite him without changing his relaxed stance. The arena remained perfectly still. Even the loudest fans sensed that this was becoming something far greater than an ordinary exhibition. Near the ropes, the promoter gripped his microphone so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. Dan Inosanto stood motionless beside the ring. Neither of them was smiling anymore. Under the bright lights, only two men seemed to exist. Chuck Norris, Bruce Lee. Chuck moved first, not aggressively, not recklessly, carefully. He shifted half a step to his left, then to his right. Testing distance, testing timing, watching for a reaction. Bruce rotated with him by only a few inches each time, just enough to remain perfectly aligned. Chuck noticed immediately. He didn't like it. He changed angles again. Bruce was already there. It was as though he knew exactly where Chuck intended to move before the decision had fully formed. A quiet murmur rolled through the audience. Most spectators had no idea what they were witnessing. Experienced martial artists understood immediately. Chuck was searching for an opening. Bruce wasn't allowing one to exist. A slight smile touched the corner of Chuck's mouth. Without warning, he snapped out a fast lead kick. Quick, sharp, accurate. The crowd gasped. From the upper seats, it appeared the strike had nearly landed. But Bruce shifted backward less than an inch. The kick sliced harmlessly through empty air, never even brushing the edge of his GI. Chuck's smile disappeared. Bruce glanced calmly toward the space where the kick had just passed before lifting his eyes. "So," he said quietly, "that was the test." Several spectators seated closest to the ring heard every word. A wave of surprise swept across the arena. Chuck offered no reply. His expression hardened. This time he moved with complete seriousness. Another step, another change of angle, then a second kick, faster, more powerful, more committed. Bruce did not retreat. Instead, he stepped directly into the attack. The instant Chuck's leg began extending, it lost nearly all of its force. Bruce's left palm barely brushed against Chuck's knee. His right hand stopped only inches from Chuck's chest. Time itself seemed to freeze. Chuck balanced on one leg. Bruce stood inside his defense. Anyone with even the slightest understanding of martial arts recognized the truth immediately. Had this been a real fight, it would already have been over. Bruce calmly lowered his hands and took a single step back. Much of the audience failed to understand what had just happened. Chuck understood perfectly. That was why his expression became even more focused. He attacked again. This time there was no smile, no showmanship, no playing to the crowd, only genuine speed. His right leg whipped toward Bruce's midsection. The strike sliced through the air with a sharp whistle. Bruce was no longer there. Without hesitation, Chuck followed with a punch, then another, then another. The combination grew longer, faster, more dangerous. Yet every exchange ended exactly the same way. Bruce moved only as much as necessary, not an inch more, not an inch less. It almost seemed as though he could see every attack before Chuck himself had fully committed to it. Gradually, the audience began noticing the strange pattern. Chuck threw the strikes. Bruce decided whether those strikes would land. Chuck increased his speed. Bruce remained perfectly calm. Chuck relied on strength. Bruce relied on understanding. That realization slowly unsettled everyone watching. Even the promoter lowered his microphone. Something was unfolding inside the ring that no dramatic commentary could adequately explain. Chuck sensed it as well. He increased the pressure, more attacks, more speed, more determination. He surged forward with a rapid series of combinations that only minutes earlier would have brought the entire arena to its feet. Bruce stepped back once, then again. The audience came alive. Chuck pursued him. Another punch, another kick, another relentless advance. Soon the rope stood directly behind Bruce. All 5,000 spectators rose together. Chuck noticed it. He decided to finish everything with one decisive attack. Driving forward with all his weight, all his strength, and every ounce of pride he possessed, he launched himself toward Bruce. At that exact instant, Bruce stepped forward, not backward, not sideways, straight into the attack. What happened next unfolded so quickly that most spectators never truly saw it. They witnessed only the result. One moment Chuck had been pressing forward. The next, he had completely lost his position. Bruce appeared beside him. Too close, too fast, too effortlessly. For the first time that evening, Chuck Norris realized the encounter was unfolding nothing like he had imagined. The arena instantly fell silent. Everyone sensed the shift. Something fundamental had changed. Chuck was no longer controlling the exchange. Bruce now dictated every moment. He looked directly at his opponent, calm and unwavering. For the first time during the demonstration, it became obvious that he could end the contest whenever he chose. Chuck understood it too. That realization only pushed him harder. He stepped forward again, then once more. He refused to retreat. He refused to wait. He refused to accept what was happening. The entire arena stood, People shouted, applauded, argued. Emotion reached its breaking point. Bruce, however, remained completely still, almost as though every moment leading up to this had been inevitable. Then Chuck launched his most determined attack of the entire evening. Time seemed to slow. Thousands of eyes remained fixed on the two men standing in the center of the ring. Chuck committed everything he had, his years of experience, his speed, and his unwavering confidence. Cries echoed through the stands. Several spectators instinctively leaned forward. Everyone expected something extraordinary. They got exactly that, just not in the way anyone had imagined. In a single instant, Bruce shifted with astonishing precision, one movement, one step. One perfectly chosen moment, and it was over. Silence settled over the arena, the kind of silence that exists only after something truly unforgettable has taken place. No one shouted, no one applauded, no one even seemed to breathe. The audience stared, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Chuck remained motionless. For several long seconds, he stood exactly where he was, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as though replaying every movement in his mind. Then something happened that surprised everyone. He slowly exhaled, lifted his gaze toward Bruce, and smiled. There was no frustration, no anger, no attempt to excuse what had happened, only a quiet smile born from understanding. He had accepted a truth that could no longer be denied. The entire arena waited for him to speak. Chuck looked across the audience before turning back to Bruce. He slowly shook his head, almost in disbelief. Then he stepped forward and spoke loudly enough for every person in the arena to hear. "Now I understand." The building had become so quiet that every breath, every footstep, every small sound echoed through the space. "I came here tonight believing I already knew the answer," Chuck continued. "It turns out I was mistaken." A soft murmur passed through the audience. No one interrupted him. Everyone listened. "I believed I understood the limits of human skill." He paused. "But tonight I witnessed something entirely different." Chuck looked directly into Bruce's eyes. "And I respect the truth enough to admit it." For several seconds, no one moved. Then the arena exploded. The applause crashed through the building like an avalanche. People cheered, whistled, raised their hands high above their heads. Some simply stood smiling, fully aware that they had witnessed something extraordinarily rare. Not because someone had won, but because a man had found the courage to acknowledge another person's greatness openly. Chuck extended his hand. "Tonight," he said, "you were the better man." Bruce looked at the offered hand for a brief moment. Then he accepted it with complete calm. There was no celebration, no triumphant expression, no desire to appear victorious. It was almost as though winning had never been the point. That reaction surprised the audience more than anything else they had seen all evening. Thousands of people had expected some visible display of victory. Instead, Bruce simply nodded. "Victory means nothing," he said quietly, "if it isn't accompanied by respect." His words spread through the arena almost instantly. The applause grew even louder. Chuck smiled once again. This time there was nothing forced about it. "Perhaps," he said, "that's exactly why you've remained a legend." For the first time that evening, Bruce allowed himself a genuine smile. It was small, subtle. Yet many people noticed it. The audience remained standing, applauding without pause. No one wanted the moment to end. No one wanted to leave. No one was eager to return to ordinary life. They understood they had experienced something exceptionally rare. Years later, almost no one remembered the exact sequence of techniques. Few remembered how long the demonstration lasted. Almost no one could describe every movement. But everyone remembered what truly mattered. A strong person is not someone who never loses. A strong person is someone who can face the truth, even when that truth is difficult to accept. That was why, years later, people rarely spoke about the demonstration itself. Instead, they remembered what happened afterward. They remembered the moment when pride gave way to respect. The moment when two legendary martial artists reminded an entire arena of one simple truth. True greatness is not revealed by victory. It is revealed by the way a person carries themselves after the contest is over.